Thank you for coming to the first panel of this great and important conference. My name is Professor Ben Carrington. I'm a sociologist based at the University of Texas at Austin, as you can tell by my accent. I'm also a Carnegie Research Fellow at Leeds Metropolitan University here in the UK. We have two great panelists and two very good talks today. First up, we have Professor Minkah Makalani, who's a historian based at the University of Texas at Austin in the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies. His talk today is entitled West Indian Through and Very British, CLR James Beyond the Boundary and Coloniality in Theorizing Caribbean Independence. After Professor Makalani has spoken, then Professor Roy McCree will speak. He's based at the University of the West Indies in Trinidad and is located in the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies, and he is a sociologist. The title of Professor McCree's talk today is The Boundaries of Publication, the Untold Story of Beyond the Boundary. So we have both sociologists and historians and all of the interdisciplinary insights that will emerge from that. So a great panel. And first up, Professor Makalani. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming, and thanks to the conference organizers, especially for giving me the unenviable task of trying to follow Robert Hill's presentation, which I had never hoped to do. So this is, just as a preface, this is part of a very new research project that I'm engaging now, which is trying to look at CLR James's return to Trinidad from 58 to 62, and then his return again under house arrest in 65, and then to run for Workers' and Farmers' Party in 66, to try and understand, one, the nature of his break with Williams beyond the kind of cursory explanations that we generally get, and his criticisms of Williams, but also, more importantly, how James is trying to conceptualize democracy or a democratic form of governance beyond available forms of democracy, and how that comes about and how we see it amplified in his return to Trinidad. So I'm African American. I've only watched 2 matches of cricket. I couldn't tell if it was a test match or whatnot. I don't know what any terminology means. I just figured out what the crease is with his presentation. So this is a bit of an ignorant presentation in terms of thinking about cricket in any kind of serious way. I can think about artistry and baseball, but it doesn't really translate. So I'll just focus on today trying to look at these questions of coloniality that I see in Beyond the Boundary and in other texts that James writes that center around or revolve around this moment when he's back in Trinidad. So I want to have 2 prefatory quotes. One is from Salman Rushdie's The Satanic Verses, and this was the only way that I would ever quote Rushdie. The trouble with the English is that their history happened overseas, so they don't know what it means. And then from the preface to Beyond the Boundary. To establish his identity, Caliban, after 3 centuries, must himself pioneer into regions Caesar never knew. And I want to maybe disagree a tad bit, though not forcefully with Dr. Hill, on what that meaning might be. In May 1963, CLR James wrote various Caribbean intellectuals and public figures announcing the publication of his celebrated Beyond the Boundary. He wrote not to tell anyone what they should think about his book, he assured V.S. Naipaul, but to, quote, tell you what I think. In a style that has led some scholars to mistakenly judge James as an Anglophile, he announced the complex nature of his work. Remarking on the early chapters about his family and education and earlier Caribbean cricketers, he wrote, quote, the book is West Indian through and through. Yet he followed that statement with the profoundly enigmatic claim, quote, but the book is very British. That is what we are. We shall never know ourselves until we recognize that fully and freely and without strain. And as if to ensure that no one misunderstood, he qualified his provocation with possibly the most important insight into his period in Trinidad. Quote, but that does not end it, not at all. That is only the beginning. I believe that originating as we are within the British structure, but living under such different social conditions, we have a lot to say about the British civilization itself, which we see more sharply than they themselves. If James could conclude upon arriving in London in 1932 that he had learned in Trinidad all that England had to teach him, some 30 years later he seemed to bring that observation full circle. Closing that circle, however, entailed something more than merely a better perspective on the Caribbean's Britishness. I want to suggest that James's oft-repeated claim that the Caribbean is thoroughly modern involved a double move. On the one hand, he instantiates the Caribbean at the founding of modernity, its origination in British civilization, signaling what Sylvia Wynter and Walter McNullo might call the coloniality of Western civilization, or more properly, modernity/coloniality, and I'll explain these in a second. Related to this, the Caribbean's coloniality required a practice of thought that would consciously seek to shed dominant systems of thought and pursue a future beyond the mere end of formal colonialism with national independence in order to exceed the series of relationships and social structures that make up coloniality. Walter McNullo, in extending the Peruvian philosopher Enrique Dussell's notion of coloniality as the underside of modernity, observes that while modernity is presented as the rhetoric of salvation, it hides coloniality, which is the logic of oppression and exploitation. Coloniality thus indexes not colonialism, but the range of practices and knowledge regimes by which, as Wynter put it, the modern structures power, knowledge, and being around corresponding designations of the civilized and uncivilized, man and non-man, human and unhuman, which culminate in contemporary designations of the European and non-European and their corresponding racial designations. The ability of coloniality to disarticulate or tear apart democracy from colonialism and plantation slavery, science from theology, governance from the dysfunctional state, enlightenment from tradition, legal processes from genocidal violence is, following Richard Aiton, precisely what renders colonialism, along with slavery, genocide, citizenship, the self-determined nation state, and the post-colony, one among a series of conveniences available to coloniality. We might therefore see James in suggesting the Caribbean's very Britishness, signaling an analytical perspective by which the colonized begin to move beyond dominant modes of thought by drawing on colonized and delegitimized knowledges, what we might call a decolonial term, which, as Caribbean philosopher Nelson Maldonado Torres argues, quote, highlights the epistemic relevance of the enslaved and colonized search for humanity that begins to open up the sources for thinking and to break up the apartheid of theoretical domains through renewed forms of critique and epistemic creolization. With Beyond a Boundary, James inaugurates a decolonial project of theorizing a new democratic form adequate to the particular challenges facing the Caribbean. Many will certainly recognize his presentation of cricket as a dramatic art form, his return to the Athenian city-state as a model for the possibilities of Caribbean democracy. Indeed, this is clear if we read Beyond a Boundary together with Every Cook Can Govern, and his thinking about the democratic possibilities of cinema outlined in American civilization. This is also in thinking of his thinking after the Hungarian Revolution. Reading James somewhat against himself, I want to suggest that what we see in this period is something quite different than merely looking back at Athens or to Jean-Jacques Rousseau's notion of general will for a model of politics. What intrigued James about Rousseau, it bears pointing out, was Rousseau's break with and critique of Enlightenment thinkers. And thus, it may have been sparked more by James's own critique of Enlightenment and modernity that begins in 1932. And although it's rather diffuse, in Black Jacobins, it's most succinctly captured in this description of Toussaint Louverture's failure with the Haitian Revolution, where he says that Toussaint's failure is the failure of enlightenment, not of darkness. And he in turn sees that Jean-Jacques Dessalines could see so clearly where Toussaint could not, because the ties binding the slave to French civilization were the slenderest. In other words, we could see his successes as the successes of darkness rather than enlightenment. In exploring James's critique of enlightenment and modernity in the period when he returns to Trinidad and commits himself to West Indies Federation, it seems to me that James is not looking to return to a past form of democratic governance, but is rather after a form of democracy that he is unable to fully theorize. In part, that inability to theorize such a political future stems from the continued commitment to Marxist thought and its philosophical Enlightenment underpinnings. It is also evidence of precisely that which is beyond our abilities to theorize, that which cannot be named because it is impossible, impermissible, or nonsensical as thought, because it breaks radically from normative political practices and structures of governments. I therefore want to suggest that we consider how James sought to inaugurate a habit of thought that begins precisely around bringing into existence what has not been previously thought or attempted. culling from the range of experiences of peoples and movements the frames, modes of thought, terms of order, and practices through which it becomes possible to achieve realities not yet envisioned. And I want to do this by looking at three themes that I see in Beyond a Boundary, his pamphlet, P&M Go Forward, which he publishes in '60 and then is later expanded into party politics in the West Indies, his 1960 lectures to the Public Library in Port of Spain that become modern politics, and his 1959 lecture to Huey, Jamaica, the artist in the Caribbean. And the three themes are: one, the relationship between Africa and the Caribbean; two, the Caribbean's availability to totalitarian rule; and three, how art, whether cricket or calypso, can help the Caribbean realize a medium for conceptualizing a political future beyond the nation state and available forms of democracy. It seems only appropriate then to begin where James begins his journey into those regions that Caesar never knew, standing in his bedroom window watching that now famous local batsman with a most unenviable reputation among Trinidad's elite, Matthew Bondman. Quote, "He was a young man already when I first remember him, medium height and size, and an awful character. He was generally dirty, he would not work, he would often, without shame, walk up the main street barefooted with his planks on the ground, as my grandmother would report. But that is not why I remember Matthew. For ne'er-do-well, Matthew had one saving grace: Matthew could bat. More than that, Matthew with a bat in his hand was all grace and style. He had one particular stroke that he played by going down low on one knee. It may have been a slash through the covers or a sweep to leg, but whatever it was, whenever Matthew sank down and made it, a long, low ah came from many a spectator, and my own little soul thrilled with recognition and delight. He was my first acquaintance with that genius Britannicus, a fine batsman." Presenting Bondman at the outset of his meditation on cricket as James's first acquaintance with a British kind, a genius Britannicus, the concern was not Bondman's lower class position, or as Grant Ferret suggests, how Bondman's disregard for respectability and Victorian conventions insisted on the ties between Trinidad's black middle and lower classes. Rather, it was in the style, the exaggerated sinking to one knee to execute an exquisite stroke, that signals the possibility that James saw in Caribbean people, not in politicians, intellectuals, and certainly not the elite. Bondman was suggestive for James because of his ability to master a British form, yet transform it into something specifically Caribbean. James announced in this portraiture of Bondman a meditation on art and politics that preoccupies the chapters "What Do Men Live By" and "What Is Art?" and, as Dr. Hill suggests, the book more generally. But especially in the first of these, James was reevaluating his worldview, having become, quote, "increasingly aware of the large areas of human existence that my history and my politics did not seem to cover. What did men live by? What did they want? What exactly was art, and what exactly culture?" And then we see this also in the film last night. James had come to see cricket as a potentially immensely democratic venue, yet it was in Bondman that he identified the model of the fine batsman. In The Artist and the Caribbean, the lecture that he gives in 1959 at UWI, Jamaica, James made a central claim that would appear in various contexts throughout his time in Trinidad. In making an argument for the centrality of literary arts to national life, he insisted that the Caribbean must provide its writers, quote, "the concrete freedom of the conditions so that we shall get from them the best of which they are capable, and, more important, get from them what at this stage of our existence we so much need." By '59, he was convinced that there was no, quote, medium so native to the Caribbean from which the artist can draw that strength which makes him a supreme practitioner, except for cricket, and he cites here Garfield Sobers and calypso. And I'm going to return to calypso in a minute because I want to dwell just for a moment on the importance of Bondman as a way to get at James's thinking about Africa and the Caribbean and the Caribbean's availability to totalitarian rule. Now, without going into too much details about what I see as his conflict, or the nature of his conflict with Williams and P&M, James does remark several times that his experience in Trinidad politics left him convinced that a central issue for the Caribbean, an issue he had long contemplated, but which was only clear after leaving again, was the importance of Caribbean's African heritage. Possibly his most forceful articulation of this that I know comes from a clip, and this is a clip in the documentary, Claremont Chung's documentary on Walter Rodney, where this is a study group that James is having on Marxism, with James and Selma James, with people like Walter Rodney, Norman Girvan, and others. And in the clip, he says, quote, The origins of our nation are the Maroons who ran away from the plantations and hid in the mountains. Those are the real originators of the Haitian nation, believe me. If we take James to identify those Maroons who hid in the mountains were Africans, those who, as he would say later, brought Africa with them to the Caribbean, who made the persistence of Western civilization in the Caribbean possible, we can then get a sense of James's decolonial turn from Europe toward Africa to gain a sense of what is at stake in Caribbean literature, the pursuit of something after coloniality. In the 1963 appendix to The Black Jacobins, he insists that before Caribbeans could, quote, begin to see themselves as a free and independent people, they had to clear from their minds the stigma that anything African was inherently inferior and degraded. The road to West Indian national identity lay through Africa. What becomes clear with the introduction of bondman, and this was a pseudonym that James used for the actual person, so it's significant that he chose bondman, the almost invoking enslavement. What becomes clear with the introduction of bondman is precisely the kind of figure, the kind of artist who James envisions that the Caribbean needs at the formal end of colonialism. If Dessalines could see so clearly the path that enlightenment had hidden from Toussaint, if a ne'er-do-well like Bondman, who walked about barefooted, provided James his first acquaintance with a fine batsman, if the Maroons were the originators of the Haitian nation and by extension what James understood as the Caribbean nation, and if Africans made Western civilization possible in the Caribbean, then the region Caliban was pioneering into was precisely coloniality as the fulcrum, the very condition of possibility for the modern, for British civilization, for Western civilization. Bondman represents for James not a sense of Caliban having been civilized, even if only while on the Oval, but the transformation of that form into something thoroughly Caribbean. Indeed, it was Bondman and later Sobers who had demonstrated an ability to, quote, master a medium, whatever it is, that had developed in a foreign territory, but then seek and find out what is native and build on that. When James first returned to Trinidad and agreed to work with Eric Williams, taking over as editor of The Nation and serving as secretary of the West Indies Federation Labor Party, his major commitment was to West Indies Federation, something approaching a political vision he had of a Caribbean nation. Yet he almost immediately came into conflict with Williams over leadership, the nature of the party, and most important, building a new society. James was in fact less concerned with Trinidad and Tobago's formal independence than with federation, which he viewed as an experiment toward a new conception of the political that left behind old forms. Indeed, as he would remark in his lectures at the Port of Spain Public Library in 1960, quote, the national state today, despite all its power and despite all the degradation to which it reduces the men who try to run it, never achieves its purpose. Interestingly enough, the first hint at what will become a very public break with Williams came in a 4-paragraph foreword to the December 1959 Carnival issue of The Hummingbird, where James makes the utterly fascinating claim, quote, Carnival is well established as a feature of our national life. The rhythms and ballads of Calypso have conquered the world. The singers in the tents have demonstrated their art possessed more vitality and compulsive power than the feeble attempts of the better educated in their imitations of Chopin and Chaminade, or Keats and Shelley, of John Ruskin and Robert Louis Stevenson. This excoriation of Western art, music, and literature would be unremarkable in terms of post-colonial discourse had it not come from someone so ensconced in the Western literary tradition that he could cite whole passages of Shakespeare with little thought, and who, without a hint of shame, could boldly claim that Thackeray, not Marx, bears the heaviest responsibility for me. The historian Harvey Neptune in Caliban and the Yankees notes the vexed relationship that Trinidad's intellectual elite had to Calypso. Their initial attempts to root it in a primitive notion of Trinidadian authenticity and subsequent laments over its corruption when singers turned to politics. For James, however, Calypso's vitality and compulsive power reflected nothing other than its ability to foster a new democratic future in society. If in cricket we see an example of taking a foreign form and finding what is native and developing it, and if Calypso, especially with A Mighty Sparrow, had demonstrated the ability of a Trinidadian art form to reveal to Caribbean people what we are and what we are not, to express a popular consciousness, then it was in such cultural arts and modes that the Caribbean could pursue something beyond merely an inherited democracy. James's criticism of Williams as potentially leading Trinidad toward totalitarian rule and dictatorship concerned what he viewed as the Prime Minister's inability to envision a political future that disavowed the structures of governance inherited from British colonial rule. We might therefore read Modern Politics, following Michel and Mbembe, as James's warning against a Trinidadian post-colony, where rule is not premised on a negotiation of democratic governance between rulers and ruled, but on commandment, where the sovereign ruler merely asserts their rule and exercises depth and violence, not as a means to an end, but as both the means and ends. James, in attempting to imagine a form of mass democratic participation that would require political leaders to assume a new posture rather than occupy already available models of governance toward Caribbean peoples, thus came to express a long-standing fear that the Caribbean, under someone like Williams, could easily slide to totalitarianism. And he says this most forcefully in PNM Go Forward, in noting that the rise of Machado Batista, Trujillo in the Dominican Republic, Duvalier in Haiti, he called it, quote, a false and dangerous conception that we have been so educated by the British that the instinct for democracy is established among us. Pointing to the colonial model of governance the Caribbean had inherited, James was clear. I see every sign that the tendency to naked power and naked brutality, the result of West Indian historical development, is here all around us. This has nothing to do with the supposed dictatorial plans of Dr. Williams, which was James' way of saying it had everything to do with those plans. I'm going to stop there just in the interest of time, and I can talk more in the Q&A, but what I'm really trying to get is how unpacking all of that is really helpful for thinking about a political future that we don't have a model for and that I see James trying to imagine. And thank you.
I want to begin by first thanking Dr. Andrew Smith and Dr. David Featherstone for making it possible for me to be here at this conference. I must also congratulate them for a fascinating initiative in recognizing the 50th anniversary of the publication of Beyond the Boundary. My paper examines the boundaries, constraints within which Beyond the Boundary was published back in 1963. And since that time, the reviews of Beyond the Boundary have focused primarily on its value in showing the dialectical links between sport and the process of identity formation, whether in terms of race, class, nationalism, or anti-imperialism. My paper deviates from this focus, dominant focus, by looking not so much at the book itself, but the publication process through which it was produced and its significance for what it tells us about James as a person and the constraints and contradictions which he faced in getting it published. In an attempt to provide some kind of formal analytical framework for a reading of this publication process, I use the concept of a publication figuration. The notion of figuration is taken from Norbert Elias, who used the term to emphasize the interdependent nature of social interaction, although this interaction was also characterized by asymmetries in the distribution of power, what we refer to as power imbalances, as well as the resource distribution. In this figuration, human agency could have been constrained as well as facilitated. As applied to the publication of Beyond the Boundary, James was at the center of a figuration that included friends, acquaintances, media, and publishers that spanned the Caribbean, Europe, and Australia. The publication figuration, however, was embedded in a broader figuration between metropole and colony, which it reflected and reproduced. It was within this publication and metropole colony figuration that one has to locate the boundaries as well as the contradictions within which Beyond the Boundary was published. In terms of the structure of the paper, the first part of the paper looks at James's experience trying to secure a publisher from around August 1960 to February 1961, while in the second, I examine his experiences after he had secured the publisher from May 1961 to 1963, the year it was published. Now, in his attempt to get the book published, James met with rejection in Australia, in England, and the West Indies. Professor Hill referred to a letter from that spoke to that from Arlott, and I think Professor C. Turan also referred to his attempt to get the book published in Australia through former test player a fingerton. I think it needs to be emphasized that the book was rejected originally because it tells us something about James. He was never deterred. He was never distracted. He never gave up. And if anything, it made him more focused on the book. So I want to begin with this letter he received from John Allott. My dear CLR J, alas, I am sorry to have to return your typescripts. We are posting it to Mr. Lamming now. Now, both St. John and I enjoyed it immensely. It seems to me a very good book indeed. Cricket book sales, however, apart from Star Reminiscences and the occasional Neville Cardus, are struggling nowadays, unless the writer has a fairly firm public. Thus, to break even, this book would have to do well in the West Indies. Our export manager has been there very recently, and he cannot see sales of 500. There is a point at which a book breaks even, and our experts in this matter cannot see a book achieving it. Both Johnson, John, and I are extremely sorry. On pre-war course, we could and would have published it. I do hope you may have better luck with it elsewhere. I wonder if printed and published in the West Indies, it might be a worthwhile proposition. Many regrets, kindest wishes for Christmas and the New Year. John Allott. Now, in the West Indies itself, James had tried to get the book serialized. His strategy was to have the book first serialized in the newspaper, reflecting his own experience as a journalist. So he turned to the West Indies. The Jamaican Gleaner agreed to pay $480 West Indian for the lifting rights to the book. Okay, that was his only success. The Barbados Advocate was more brutal in their rejection. So this is a reply from the Barbados Advocate at the time. Dear Mr. James, thank you for your letter of 8 February offering the serialization rights in Barbados of your book on West Indian cricket. I regret to advise you, however, that the book is not suitable for publication in the Advocate, unquote. A very terse and pointed refusal to publish the text. James' big break occurs when he was offered a publication deal by Stanley and Paul. And before I read that letter, I think we also need to understand that in the process of writing this book, James got into a very terrible accident in Jamaica. He was unconscious for a while and was, spent some time recovering from that accident while in Jamaica to do some lectures. And it was during this period of convalescence that he got this contract from Lusty. The person solely responsible for the breakthrough, however, was George Lamming, with whom he had a very close association. Lamming was able to bring the book to the attention of Robert Lusty and Stanley and Paul because they had published his seminal text in the Cast of My Skin some 8 years earlier in 1953. After review of the manuscript, Robert Lusty wrote to James, Dear Mr. James, I have been delighted to consider the manuscript of your book, Who Only Cricket Know, which has been submitted to the kind services of George Lamming. I would like most warmly to congratulate you on the achievement of your book, for it is a memorable one, and our only doubt is whether it could expect to achieve the widespread circulation which it certainly merits. The doubt arises from the possibility that cricketers might find in it too much real life, and those interested in social and political problems might find too much cricket. But I think this is a risk which we would take in the interest of getting the book into print. I'm afraid that we cannot offer particularly attractive terms, and I would suggest an advance payable on publication of £100 against royalties of 10% to £3,000 and 15% thereafter. It is a book which, in my view, requires a few illustrations or decorations, preferably line decorations, and I think that it certainly needs a rather better title than Who Only Cricket Know. I shall much look forward to your response and meeting you with a view to talking about various points, if you should be in London. That was the break James got through the company. How did James respond? Dear Mr. Lusty, I am delighted to read your view of my book and your offer of publication. Your views about illustrations and a different name I shall be glad to learn more about. I have no special views on the matter, and from long experience, I know that on these things, publishers know much more than authors. I shall do nothing to defer publication and everything to expedite it. I am fairly certain that the book will do all that can be expected as a commercial publication. I am fairly certain that the book will do all that can be expected as a commercial publication. James's optimism contrasts with John Arlett's concern that the book may not be able to break even, and also the publisher's concern about whether the book would do well in terms of sales. The thing about Beyond the Boundary that intrigued me was the title. The title. And I have read, since I've come up here, some information to the effect that the title was provided by George Lamming and perhaps even James himself. I based my examination on the letters available in the James collection at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, Trinidad. I base it on nothing else at this point in time, okay, and in preparing this paper. And I understand that not all the letters are there in the collection, some are missing, okay, as these things happen. So the title of the book, there were several, okay, there were several. One of them, the first one, Who Only Cricket Know, okay, 1961. And you have these two, WG, A West Indian Grace, a West Indian Progeny of Grace, and then the Cricket Crusaders, okay, James's final suggestion. I'm intrigued about these seemingly strange titles, okay, particularly these two. I suggest or ask 3 pointed questions, okay, as it relates to these titles. Firstly, since the term progeny means offspring, was he seeking to acknowledge the English roots of the game, or that West Indian cricket was a cultural legacy of the English? Secondly, given Grace's status as a symbol of cricketing greatness and Englishness itself, was he also suggesting that the West Indies was also capable of achieving similar greatness and being as good as or better than the colonial power at their own game and other spheres of existence? We need to bear in mind, as we all know, that the book was devoted to Grace, and there's a whole chapter devoted to Grace. James wasn't just consumed by the literary critique to whom we made reference this morning. James was also consumed by Grace and what he symbolized and what he represented. So these are some of the questions I throw out in terms of trying to understand the motivation or the meaning of these titles that James suggested for the text. But whatever reasons that could be inferred, adduced to James for coming up with these names, the publisher rejected all of them. This is the publisher's letter. I'm sorry to bother you again about the title of your book, but we are having second thoughts on your decision to call it The Cricket Crusaders. The point is that this book is being published under the Hutchinson imprint, and it is felt that we should try to avoid any reference to cricket, particularly as your work has a more important theme than cricket. Our editorial committee felt that the title should have an ambiguous reference to cricket rather than a direct one. In the circumstances, it has been decided that Beyond the Boundary would now be the most appropriate title to give the book. I do hope you agree with this and appreciate that our decision has taken in the interests of the appeal which the book will have for readers. James responded, Dear Mr. Lusty, I have read your letter with very great interest, and I am able to tell you pretty much what I think practically at once. As I have been reading the proofs and rereading the book, I confess frankly that I am personally astonished at the way in which what I have written has extended beyond the boundary. Therefore, your statement that the book should not look like another volume of cricketing reminiscences, I find very sympathetic. That's the end of my reading of the letters. The issue of the naming of the book, not by James, based on the letters I have read, but by the publisher, invites the issue of the contradictions that underline the text, or the boundaries within which the text was published. When I talk about the boundaries of publication, I refer particularly to the influence that the publisher exerted on its naming, the date of publication, as well as royalty payments. Now, we can argue that James's publication experiences are merely typical of the general publisher-author relationship, and see, even between journal editors and authors, as it relates to issues of editing, the title and publication dates, etc. The decisive difference, however, to me, lie in the colonial context or period in which James was writing, the origins or social location of author and publisher, as well as the socio-political significance or message of the book. In this regard, I make 3 related observations. Firstly, while James saw West Indian cricket as a symbol of resistance to British rule, the very publication of the book on cricket still depended heavily on a British publisher. Secondly, although the book was published at a time when the movement for political independence had gone into high gear in the Caribbean, which saw the granting of independence to Trinidad and Jamaica in 1962, there was still heavy economic dependence on Britain at that point in time. I see the production of the book as an extension of this dependence in the realm of publishing, as opposed to, say, agriculture. Thirdly, in relation to the title Beyond a Boundary, this has become a sort of discursive code beyond the boundary to signify the function that cricket has served in the West Indies as a symbol of West Indian anti-British imperialism, decolonization, democratization, and regionalism. As we have shown, or as I've tried to show, the great irony is that while assuming all these meanings, the term was created not by a West Indian or a colored person, but by a white-owned British company of publishers whose choice of it was significantly influenced more by commercial as opposed to political considerations and meanings and symbolisms. Put differently, while the title of the book has gained currency as a political slogan of political resistance, it is important to note that the publisher was motivated by commercial considerations as much as they may have been by the need to capture the deeper socio-political significance of the text. In short, the naming of the book serves to capture the asymmetrical nature of publisher-author relations, which was reflective of the asymmetrical nature of broader metropole-colony relations on the whole in which the book was produced. I think this imperialist and kind of dependency reading, however, could be seen as rather simplistic, and I make two qualifications in that respect. Firstly, we must admit that notwithstanding its asymmetrical nature, it is within this same figuration of metropole and colony and publisher and author that James got the opportunity and James got the support to publish his work, which he did not receive in the West Indies. This figuration was thus facilitating as much as it was constraining. Secondly, though having to depend on a British publisher and a British book market, it took a book written by a black West Indian or colonial at the time to set a new literary benchmark in the study of sport in general and cricket in particular. The formidable literary impact on the study of cricket, therefore, preceded the formidable impact of the West Indian cricket team during the dominance of world cricket in the 1980s and early 1990s. The literary impact of James on sport writing helps illustrate the fact that the metropole-colony duality or relationship was not unidirectional, as they both influence each other, although not to the same degree. The publication of Beyond the Boundary, which I have abbreviated as BABY, the publication of BABY and the marking of the 50th anniversary of its publication remains a reflection of this fact and the enduring legacy of James in the study of popular culture. The baby has come of age. Thank you very much.
Thank you to both of the speakers. For those of us who do work in sports and often try to publish our work, your summary of James's own battles with the publishers and the unequal power relationship kind of rings painfully true. I do now have a nice retort to when the publishers say, well, we won't even be able to shift 500 copies of this, is when they said the same thing to James. You know, so I think we can all kind of bring that one out when the publishers say that we just can't sell this book unless we change the title. And at least I didn't tell him he needs to turn it into a textbook. I think that would be the only difference between today's publishers and then.
My partner for 30 years, Cicely Spencer Cross in Barbados, is a theatre director. Just 2 weeks ago, she directed a production of George Lamming's Castle of My Skin to celebrate the 60th anniversary of his publication. She told George Lamming that I was coming to this conference. And George told her that he was very much involved with the publication of Beyond the Boundary. And he also told her, and I'm quoting, a phone call, that he had advised the publisher of a title called Beyond the Boundary. And this is conversation took place on Sunday on the phone from Barbados to Scotland. But it does tie a little bit towards what you mentioned this morning, Dr. Hill, that Laming was involved in the, but it was through the publisher and not through James himself. That's all I want to say. Thank you very much.
Tony Bateman from De Montfort University. I'm confused. This morning we listened to a superb account of what were basically the three moments of Beyond the Boundary. And we just heard of another interesting paper, two interesting papers, one particularly for me interesting on the publication of Beyond the Boundary and some of the history behind it. Now the last CLR James conference I went to was in 2009 at Oxford University, just a day's seminar more than a conference. And a claim was made that day that only 60% of the original manuscript was published and that the remaining 40% is still sitting on a shelf at Random House Publishers. Is that a myth? Do we know? Can we cast any light on that?
Yeah, it's a fabrication.
The answer is it's a myth.
I just wanted to sort of reinforce what the first speaker said. No, at the 2001 conference, marking James's 100th birthday, George, in his address, spoke in detail about his intervention, about the title. That, if I recall correctly, he said that the title he had suggested was Beyond the Boundary, and then the publishers then changed it to Beyond a Boundary. So that was something that George said publicly, and so I took that to be, pretty final.
Wait, do you want to?
Yeah, there is a letter from Laming to James about a meeting he had with Robert Lusty. And it's a letter in which he states the points one by one. And one of the points raised is that, I'm not quoting directly, but the title that James had, he said that title won't do. That's the last letter I have of Laming on the matter of the title. Okay, he also suggested to James, made certain suggestions concerning content. Okay, he found that some of the chapters or some of the issues were too parochial, were too Trinidadianish, that would not have an impact on his British audience. Okay, so Laming's influence went beyond the title, also in terms of content. I don't think James took the advice, okay, in terms of content. Secondly, there was the issue of when it will be published. James first wanted it to be published to coincide with the Australian Western History of Australia, okay, and which didn't happen. He then wanted it to be published in 1962. Laming made it clear that publication should be 1963, okay? It was published in 1963, okay? I am getting and this is all in a letter of Laming, to James. There is a period where there are no letters between James and Laming. And my approach to that was to speak to Laming. He's right next door in Barbados. I'm in Trinidad. It's a 40-minute flight. I haven't done that as yet. But there are some missing letters between James, and I'm assuming there were letters, okay, that I need to see to get a clearer idea on the extent of Laming's influence. His influence was formidable. As I think Professor Hill said, he was a literary agent. He made it possible. But in terms of the title, the letter that I read to you from Lusty doesn't give me any other thing to go on in terms of the letter. So I'm not disputing the claim that Laming suggested the title. But the publisher is saying our editorial committee met and we decided that Beyond the Boundary is the best title in order to avoid the book being too crickety and so on. That's the letter I'm going on. So I'm not dismissing the claim as to Laming's influence in shaping the title of the text. But the way we work in the social science, when there is no material evidence, anything else is allegation and speculation. So I use the letters, and I'm constrained by those letters. But I now have to deal with it so that I could give a correct representation of the publication process and Lamming's role in it.
Derek Barnard from the Cricket Society. What interests me is whether James made any money out of the book, because if it was today, of course, you know, you've written a book of this significance. Dickie Bird, when he gets down to his last million, trots out the same stuff that's come out in the past few weeks, 80 not out, which will mean he'll spend another 3 years counting his bank balance. Did he make any money? Because my observations are, of everything I've seen, that James lived in poverty to some extent. Somebody told me that he used to go and say, I want to come and see a friend for a day and stay for a year. Can you throw any light on that at all?
I can't speak to that in terms of the sources of information I have. There was no letter that speaking to the extent of the profits that the book generated. What I could tell you is that, and it doesn't answer your question, but what it does speak to is the fact that the book went contrary to the expectations or fears of John Allard and the publisher in terms of breaking even. In 2002, Sport Illustrated ranked Beyond the Boundaries as 36th best book of all time. Of the 100 books on sport, it was ranked 36th.
And do we know what the original print run was?
No, there's no information I have personally, based on his collection, okay, that speaks to the issue of profits.
Because the first edition now is selling.
Well, there was actually, I don't know in terms of the sales numbers of what it would mean, but at one point the publisher wanted to do a, which maybe doesn't get exactly at your question, but they wanted to do a West Indian run. And so they got him to agree to reduce his royalties so that it could be profitable. I don't know, and maybe Salman James has a better idea of how much he may have made on it, but to me that suggests that essentially what he was more concerned with was getting it out and getting into a particular kind of audience. So he's willing to take a significant cut in the royalty, I think almost half of what he had originally agreed to, so that it could circulate.
Well, I mean, I think they missed a trick, because what they should have done is published in 62, Arlott would have reviewed it in 63, which was the centenary edition of Wisden. Now, I first came aware of the book in 64 because that was the first Wisden I purchased, and Arlott writes 2 pages on reviewing the book.
James wanted it published in 62, but the publisher didn't want it published in 62.
No, I think they missed a trick.
And 3 things I want to say: that the book has done well and continues to do well. I'm not aware that James has done well through the book.
Right.
Thirdly, James in the letter was clearly saying he is confident that the book will do well as a production. This is James speaking. No, well, he was on solid ground, you know. And it was in the context of John Allard's questioning whether it would sell, okay, or break even, and also Robert Lusty questioning whether it would do well. In that context, we have to locate James's optimism, you know, about this book.
I want to thank the second speaker for reinforcing the idea that W.G. Grace is actually the ambivalent, strange, central figure of the book, which I'll try to display tomorrow morning. But I really wanted to ask a question to the first speaker. One of the ways in which, in a sense, the colonial rules is partly been able to kind of control names and so forth. And you might say there's always that ambivalence between English and British, and I suppose the Scots amongst us will know that the English control things by sort of being able to say English or British along the way whenever. And you might say that the 3 main fascinations of that early period and most of James's life were English literature, the English game of cricket, and you might even say English Puritanism. And I wonder if you could say anything about that kind of strange thing of the sort of elision between English-British and those kinds of considerations.
I mean, in terms of if he's trying to say something broader than just what's going on in England to talk about the British Empire, if that's kind of what you're getting at, I think he is more interested in, and this is why he's saying very British, to talk about it in kind of an imperial context. And then I think it's making these claims not about kind of the greatness of Britain or the empire, but to make these claims that are actually critical and trying to get at what is the basis of this empire, what is the basis of this civilization. But in terms of the other kind of issues of nominalism that you might be raising, I'm not quite sure I get them. Or
I don't know, early on you talked about English history, and then other points you kind of talked about British in terms of the genus Britannicus, in terms of everything.
right. Well, the British is his language. If I said English, that's probably my American slippage.
Thank you.
Okay, two comments. The
Could you
first
say who you are,
time,
please?
sorry, Paul Sutton.
Thank you.
The first comment really relates to the issue of Greek Olympic Games and Athens, and I make a comment that it was either the Colonial Home Secretary, therefore charged of decolonising Trinidad, or even Prime Minister Macmillan, who made the comment in 1960 that Trinidad was the Athens of the Caribbean. And that comment, of course, was made in the context of the democratic movement that the PNM had released in 1956 onwards. And I think it goes down very well with the comments that Dr. Hill was making this morning about the moments and the particular configurations of time. And the second point that I want to make is in relationship to Williams's and James's break. And I think that the record shows that it was Williams that broke with James rather than James that broke with Williams. And of course there is an interesting counterfactual here, which is how long would the relationship have lasted if in fact Williams had not broken with him at that particular time.
There's not a lot in the records, in the archives, that I've been able to find, at least, from Williams to James. There's correspondences of James to Williams, but I haven't seen anything from back that would allow me to talk about that.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Brian Elaine. Two quick questions. First to the first speaker. I just wanted to say a few words about this concept of coloniality, which I'm not quite sure I understand what work it's supposed to do in the overall context of what you said. And with respect to McCree, I wondered, Roy, if you had a few words to say about the contemporary reception of Boundary amongst a younger generation of Caribbeans.
Oh, and talking about coloniality, it's drawing primarily on work of Enrique Dussels, a Peruvian philosopher, liberation theorist, and Walsh McNullo, and a number of others, particularly now coming out of Caribbean Philosophical Association. But coloniality is trying to talk about a range of structures, social relationships, and knowledge regimes that kind of create this dichotomy between, say, the European and non-European that become fundamental to understanding the kind of perpetuation of these relationships that we really can highlight in the context of slavery, in the context of colonialism. But it suggests a much more profound critique than you get out of, say, post-colonial theory or you get out of Marxism, which the argument would be that those come from within the context of modernist Enlightenment thought, and that with a decolonial turn, drawing on the practices and knowledges of those who are colonized, who are enslaved, that allows and begins a much more profound break with kind of those ordering knowledges and ordering structures, so that part of the, again, from Achille and Mbembe, part of the problem after colonialism is the perpetuation of those same relationships, so that independent nation state is just one more form that coloniality takes, and the push is to get something much more beyond the perpetuation of those relationships and systems of knowledge.
What I can say to speak to that question is I have been teaching the sociology of sport at the University of the West Indies since 2001, and James is one of the readings on my examination of sport and social structure in the Caribbean. But I teach sociology of sport to management students, sport management students, who normally tend not to see the relevance of history and culture to the process of managing anything. If I answer your question in terms of their response, it would be to say that James has been lost. James has been lost beyond the boundary, let me say that, beyond the boundary as a text on sport and popular culture has been lost to a new generation of Caribbean students, particularly in sociology. The same doesn't apply to his other works that form part of the teaching at A-levels, secondary school, high school, and also history and teaching of history and politics at the university. So you have party politics in the West Indies, Black Jacobins. Okay, these are still standard texts in the teaching of James at the university in the Caribbean across more than one discipline. Beyond the Boundary is struggling in terms of getting a kind of intellectual and academic attention, which I hope to change with my students the next time around, since I'll be making it mandatory that they read a chapter for 5 marks. If you don't give it marks, they won't read it.
So I was a little worried when you started talking about Matthew Bondman, because you were getting very close to where I'm hoping to venture tomorrow. But
Okay.
then you stopped short. So, but I had a question, because you mentioned that Matthew Bondman is a pseudonym,
Yeah.
which I hadn't heard before. So if you could say something a bit more about that, and also if you know anything more about his personal biography. That's kind of a question I want to ask tomorrow.
From what I know in terms of the personal biography of Bondman, I don't know the name. As I mentioned to you, I ended up meeting CLR James's niece and did an interview with her and her brother. And so the family rented from the James family, I think, and just roundly disreputed by James's parents and sister. And I get the impression more around in the community. By the time that he wrote Beyond the Boundary, he was convinced that no one from the family was still alive. But he used a pseudonym because the publisher didn't want to have any problems with presenting someone who could then come back and sue or something of that nature. So that was the impetus for the pseudonym. But what I found was interesting was that he chose Bondman when he could have chose any other number of names. You know, it's not coincidental, I think, that he chose something that kind of invokes slavery, invokes bondage in some kind of way, particularly given how central that character is to setting up the story that he tells. So it's not, I think, an accident that you have that kind of invocation to then tell this story about cricket, which for him is this story about independence and the possibility in the Caribbean.
Yeah, I'd just like to point out that if one is talking about this book being lost to the contemporary generation of West Indian students, we should note that Ian Randall Publishers has just published a college edition of this book for the Caribbean. One reason the difficulty of university students getting access to the book is that there was no West Indian edition of it, and a new specifically commissioned university edition has just been brought out with a new introduction by Hilary Beckles, and it's only available in the Caribbean. You can't buy this outside. Here it is. So, you know, if we're talking empirically about the state of this book and its place in West Indian education, we should note the existence of this new college edition.
I'd like to thank you for your engagement and your questions, and especially to Professors Makalani and McCree for 2 wonderful talks today. Professor McCree started off by invoking Elias and the figurationists, and one of the things that the figurationists often have a problem with is, in terms of their broader conception of the civilizing process, is accounting for clearly uncivilized moments in human history. And they tend to refer to them as de-civilizing spurts. So you have these kind of spurts, and that supposedly doesn't negate the broader kind of civilizing process kind of framework. I think we might think of Beyond the Boundary as a decolonizing spurt at the very least. And so the discussion today, I think, has been a really good one. So thank you for your time. See you back at 2. Thank you very much.